Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Happy Cynics. This is Dr. K, Kevin Twain Lowry, and with me is my co-host and producer, Isaac, the all-seeing eye dog, Dillman.
Howdy, howdy.
Okay, today we are going to indulge ourselves in narcissism. We're going to talk about narcissistic Christianity. Christianity didn't always have that emphasis, but you might say that in the West, we've kind of perfected hedonistic, narcissistic religion in Christianity.
Well, and we figured since we have a podcast and we know what everybody should think, we should talk about how you shouldn't be a narcissist.
Yeah, I know there's mixed opinions on that, but narcissism, well, it is, and we're not really going to focus, we're not going to basically tackle the theological arguments that this is not really sound with biblical teaching and all that, although we will point out some things about that, because I certainly, I don't... It's kind of hard to read the Gospels and then picture Jesus advocating narcissism of a kind that we sometimes see today. And I think a lot of people that engage in this or indulge in this, maybe is what I want to say, are not even really aware that that's what they're doing. So it...
Well, and so what do you, when we're talking about narcissism, what kind of behaviors are you talking about?
Well, I think it's really like an exaggerated sense of importance. I know everybody wants to feel like we're important. What we do is important. Everybody wants to have a sense of purpose in life. But we get this kind of Christianity where it's like somehow every little mundane detail of a person's life is somehow part of God's cosmic plan. As though like, God gets glorified if I eat the sandwich he wants me to eat for lunch today. And I know that sounds kind of mundane or it sounds a little far-fetched, but I mean, I've had classes where half of the students, like I'll give them like polling questions about what do you think about this? How much control does God exert in the world? And I have like a whole range of responses, and half of them like respond that they think that everything that happens, good and bad, is all part of God's plan. And I, just like with the hurricanes and tornadoes and other stuff, I don't know how you reconcile that. And I don't know why you would even want to reconcile that unless you just have this kind of obsession that somehow every little detail of your life somehow has this great cosmic importance. Okay.
Well, so how much of that do you chalk up to just like anxiety and finding comfort in things like, his eye is on the sparrow, and so he watches me?
I don't, let's put it this way. Most of the people that, okay, and this is anecdotal, of course, but the people I encounter who are guilty of this are not people that are suffering, that have difficulties they're going through. So like his eyes on the sparrow, or say, if you go back to the spiritual songs of the American slaves. Okay. Mm-hmm. I don't fault anybody for wanting to have some sense of hope that God's going to help us. But it's really these folks that their lives are actually pretty cushy to begin with. And they think that that's all part of God's plan. It's like, I
see the difference.
Yeah. So it's like, the reason I'm doing so well is because it's all part of God's plan. And I think there's also a sense of, a certain shirking of responsibility. Because I think a lot of people, they don't want to have to accept responsibility for the decisions that they make. They want to just say, oh, well, God has a reason. Everything that happens is all part of God's plan. And I'll say this isn't limited, or certainly limited to, Christianity. But this isn't historically, hasn't really been a thing of Christianity until, say, the 19th century, when and during the Romantic period, where there was this shift toward feelings, and religion became more about feelings than it was about orthodoxy or sacraments or things like that. And but I mean, I know Muslims are also very deterministic and think that everything that happens is God's will. And you have some Taoists and others that kind of view the world very deterministically, the same kind of thing.
Well, I mean, you could extend that to Calvinists as well.
Well, yeah.
At least the extreme side of Calvinism tends to see everything as being predetermined, not just your eternal salvation.
Well, see, Calvin was the one, Calvin and Luther, the Protestant reformers were the ones that basically revived this old world thinking. Let's put it this way. The determinism was a part of Christianity. So I'm not saying that. Medieval Christianity was very deterministic, and Augustine believed in predestination, and certain people were chosen to be saved and everybody else is a reprobate and things like that. But this notion that somehow God's plan involves everything good that happens in my life was, the direct action of God. So if I pass a test, thank you, Jesus, for helping me pass the test, or making me pass the test, or whatever.
Yeah. Well, could you see the sort of the opposite, not the opposite, but like a different expression of the same sort of belief when something goes wrong that's like sort of a minor inconvenience and it gets blamed on Satan?
Oh, yeah.
Because that's something that I see a lot more of than I see the positive side of.
Well, and that's another thing. And that's I think that's also part of, that's always been a part of a lot of religions too. Although early Judaism didn't really have this, like a strong belief that there's like an element of evil in the world. Certainly the ancient Hebrews believed in evil and all that, but not like you have, say, like the ancient mythologies where you have certain figures that are more like underworld figures, and they're working to try to get people to indulge in vices and things that are destructive. And then you end up with the figure of Satan and the devil or whatever. And you have, this is a way of also, again, it becomes a convenient excuse for people. It's like, oh, well, the devil made me do it, and I know it was a comedian, Flip Wilson, I think, kind of made that into a punchline. I don't know if you've ever seen clips of him.
No, I'm not familiar with him.
Okay. So Flip Wilson was a black comedian in the late 60s, early 70s, and he had his own variety show on TV, and we used to watch it every week, and he was hilarious. One of the things he did was he portrayed a character in drag named Geraldine.
Risque.
Yes. So he dressed up like a woman in a dress and everything, with eyeshadow and fake eyelashes and the whole 9 yards. And then he would, talk in his high voice, and his, like this alter ego, Geraldine. And he said that his, but he said, the devil made me do it, and then, people used to laugh at that. But that was a part of, some of his shtick.
So I've actually seen this, almost that behavior a little different, because nobody was acting, but the devil was certainly controlling what decisions were being made, at least in these people's minds. So I've mentioned before, I used to travel leading worship at summer camps and stuff. And so our band was at a summer camp in northern Michigan, actually. And the night before, we were supposed to go on this canoe kayak trip down this river up in northern Michigan. It was going to be really nice. It was supposed to be like a highlight of the week that we were going to spend up there. But the night before this happens, one of the campers at this campground was playing tag or something like that in an unlit field that happened to have one of those like guy wires that come down from like telephone poles and electricity lines and stuff, and just ran smack dab straight into it.
Oh.
And like really hurt themselves. I mean, I think they had a concussion. They're fine, but they had a concussion that was like pretty bad. And the camp director decided, you know what? The devil is just out to get us at this camp. The devil is, trying to harm us. And so we just think it's too risky for us to take all these kids on this kayak trip down this river.
Really?
Because the devil's going to try and drown them in the river. And so we're just going to stay and not do anything in the campground. Yeah.
And
so that was...
And all the teens said, amen.
Yeah. Everybody was really happy with that decision. The devil made them choose not to go on the kayak trip.
Yeah. Well,
the devil was calling the shots there.
The devil made that kid run into the guide wire or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Nothing random. Nothing can just be an accident. It's the devil has to be causing things, because that's important for the devil to be worried about.
So, yeah, I know that. I mean, this technically isn't narcissism, but there's like a certain point where people just don't want to accept responsibility for their bad decisions.
For not providing lights in an area that kids should not be running in at night.
Right. I mean, even just to say, hey, what are you doing running around without light where you can't see where you're going? I mean, that just seems to be common sense.
Or I'm pretty sure you're supposed to have like reflectors on those wires, but they didn't have them. Like, it was definitely a little bit of a cop out of their responsibility. Yeah.
So, I mean, where does this kind of thinking come from? So, I think there could be a number of causes for it. I mean, I think there are some people that they just want to feel important. And, for example, like even some of the places I've been, it's like, I hear people sometimes say, we're not just doing X, Y, and Z. Everything we do is a part of the kingdom of God and has all these like cosmic, consequences. Or they would say, you're going into ministry, every service could be somebody's last service, and you might be saving somebody from hell if you don't preach a good sermon or if you don't prepare each week. And I mean, there's just I know that these things are important, but it's like people want to feel like the fate of their world is on their shoulders whenever they're doing just even some routine thing. It's like, I don't know. I mean, if you drink too much coffee and you have to pee in the middle of the service, that might cause somebody to lose track of the sermon, and they may end up going to hell, and it might be your fault. It's like this kind of exaggerated importance of everything. To me, people take themselves way too seriously in a lot of cases.
God gave them that parking spot.
Oh, yeah, there's those. And it's just like the people are praying for their team to win. And, I don't really have a problem. Like if an athlete wants to say, I want to thank God for helping me do my best and keep me from getting injured. But it's like when they say, oh, God helped us win the championship. Well, you don't think there's other people believing God on the other team too? I mean, it's
if you're not on Tim Tebow's team, you are the devil.
He's not that bad, is he?
No, I have no idea.
Well,
I mean, I don't follow Tim Tebow. I just know that he was the guy back when I was in high school who would like pray on the football field. And got a lot of props for that.
Yeah, he would do that. it's kind of funny because even people that aren't religious, they'll still do the kind of quasi-religious, like point up to the sky or whatever. So you don't know if they're mean this is like a religious gesture, if they're pointing to their dead grandma or what they're doing.
Yeah, well, you got to be careful which finger they're using, too.
Well, yeah, it's usually the index finger. It's not the other one, but yeah. So it's it's just you see people and it's like okay. So let's put it this way. I think one of the causes is people want to feel important, so they tend to exaggerate the importance of what they're doing. Now. Let me say this. Okay. So now I've been happy. Now I'm going to get cynical. All right. Here a little bit. So I think back to something I read by Schopenhauer, the philosopher of pessimism. And he basically takes a crack at all the patriotic nationalist types. And he says that when people don't have anything of their own to be proud of, then their last recourse is to basically, well, you're somehow special because you are from a certain country. Because like, in other words, you're going to take credit for the country you were born in as though that's like a mark of you being an excellent person or something.
Right.
Okay. Mm-hmm. I think let's put it this way. And that's where I'm like a little careful because I know some of the folks that do this, maybe they don't really have too many other bragging rights in life. And I don't necessarily want to be harsh to somebody that just wants to feel like they're important, but I don't know that just wanting to feel important necessarily has to go to like some kind of a cosmic scale to where it's now going to start affecting the way people make decisions and the way they take responsibility for their actions and things like that.
Isn't it sort of, and we talked about earlier in a previous episode, like it's a kind of an issue of maturity, isn't it? Like at a certain point in life, it's okay to have an overinflated sense of your own importance.
Right.
But that is a childish behavior.
Right. I've seen even parents that set up children for this, like a crash and burn later in life. How many parents act like their kid's a big genius because they think that their kid's reading and writing so much faster than everybody else's kid, and then whenever the kid gets in school, they see that they're not getting any higher grades in class than other kids are.
Yeah. And it turns out they're just neurodivergent.
Yeah. There was always that too. It's like, so sometimes weirdness gets interpreted as genius. Sometimes genius.
Well, and I mean,
is
oftentimes they are the same. Yeah.
But genius
not
is
always.
Sometimes weird, but then there are people that try to look like geniuses by just acting weird.
Right.
And I mean, we all see these people too. So like the super geeks, and that's why okay. So I know maybe this is a little bit, it's a little bit off topic, but not really. But why? Okay. I laugh at like the show Big Bang Theory, but it took me a long time till I could stomach it because it just doesn't really portray genius scientist in any kind of a realistic way.
Yeah. I mean, I do not like that show.
Well,
I mean,
especially like a character like Sheldon Cooper, even somebody that would be autistic and that high functioning would not be that oblivious to understand like a basic sense of when other people are offended and things like that, let alone you have people with PhDs from top research universities and they're still going to comic book stores like 16-year-olds. And it just isn't realistic. I mean, people are
I mean,
geeky.
it's just not realistic that like you'd have a PhD candidate who has the time for hobbies. Like, I mean, the people who are in these schools doing that work, that's all they do.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, they would be in the laboratory or on their computers, writing, reading, conducting experiments. they wouldn't be like looking forward to Comic-Con and playing long extended online video games and things like that. So anyway, I don't know who makes up these characters and if they really are that oblivious to what people at that level of intellect really are like. But this kind of reminds me of this same kind of impetus where people want to inflate their own self-importance, and they exaggerate things. Yeah.
I think the characters of that show actually are a good example of like the sort of like projection that goes on in religious narcissism as well. Like the importance of, well, I'm a nerd. I play online video games, but I've never achieved anything in science. But because I can watch The Big Bang Theory, I can feel like, oh, I'm just as smart as these guys.
Right.
And that the same thing happens between religious narcissists and God and the devil. Like, oh, well, I'm just a person. I don't have any cosmic significance, but I can project my own sense of importance onto my God. Yeah. Which I think that's the like basic textbook definition of idolatry. I mean, am I wrong about that? Like, that is treating
if
God as a consumerist good.
Yeah, I mean, now let me say this. The only clarification I'd want to make is a lot of people aren't really aware that idolatry, there's aspects of this that come from ancient religion that would not be the way we would use the word today. Like, what I want to say is this. There is idolatry in the sense of worshiping something or someone in order to kind of give oneself a sense of importance. Like, oh, I'm following God or this, whatever, but it's really kind of self-serving. And that is a type of idolatry. There's another type of idolatry where it's about people trying to manipulate the gods to do what they want. And so, like, say, for example, in Shinto, the belief is that if you can create an idol that represents a god, then you can entice the god by dedicating this idol or statue to the god. You can entice the god to come inhabit that statue. And then you have the god as a captive audience to be able to try to get the god to do what you want.
Right. Well, I remember we were talking about how Judaism revolutionized ancient religions through the invention of monotheism. Mm-hmm. One of like the big implications of monotheism is that if God is alone, there is nothing to manipulate in order to have God act on your own behalf, right? So before, with polytheism, with many gods, with spirits, stuff like that, there's a sort of like supernatural realm that the gods live in. Mm-hmm. And you can manipulate that by, earning God's favors or burning, offerings. You can manipulate gods to do certain things if you perform the right rituals. But if there's only one God, there is nothing to manipulate. It's just God.
Right.
And so God acts unilaterally, which is where I think, and this is part of what I think we're trying to get to with Christian narcissism, that the idea that God acts on your behalf is sort of an ancient pagan idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I would throw this out though. I'm not so convinced that the Jews invented monotheism. That seems to come from Zoroastrianism, which they probably picked up during the Persian exile. That's another episode for another day. I've mentioned that before. But I think a lot of biblical scholars today, say of Hebrew scripture scholars, would take the view that pre-exile, the Hebrews seem to be henotheistic. Like the language is more that there are multiple gods, but you shall have no other gods before me. I will be the primary chief God for you and the only God. You just can't worship these other gods. But then by the time of Isaiah, of the exile, it's like, those are just stone and wood. They're not real. And you get that restated also in Deuteronomy, which was also an exilic period text.
Yeah. And I'll have, for those who are interested in this sort of like tangent, there's a Yale lecture that they put on YouTube that's all about like this shift in the ancient Near East.
Right.
I'll put a link to it in our references.
Yeah,
it's very interesting.
That's helpful stuff. So yes, I think you're right. In monotheism, you get back to God that can't be manipulated. And this is why David Hume argued in the 18th century, like Christian scholars for a number of centuries tried to argue that monotheism was the oldest form of religion, and then all the pagans created polytheism. And before we really had like textual archaeological textual evidence from archaeological digs, okay, a lot of it was kind of speculation and conjecture. David Hume argued the opposite, that the more natural indigenous form of religion is many gods, and even pointed to like different tribes of people in different parts of the world. And they tend to be very animistic, where there's a whole bunch of spirits and, there's a spirit in everything. Like everything has this ultimate importance. There is a sense where this kind of Christian narcissism actually takes Christianity away from monotheism
and back to. So that was the point I was trying to get to.
Exactly. It takes it back to a type of paganism where everything has this kind of cosmic importance, where in monotheism, it was more the case that God governs the world, but God's not necessarily causing everything that happens. And most of what happens is our responsibility. And so you end up with human beings being responsible for what's going to happen. And this is where I do think it is a type of maturity, when it gets to the point where people just don't want to accept responsibility. Like somebody wants to say, "Oh God, why did you kill so many people in those storms that went through Florida? And why didn't you do something about it?" And God would say, "Why didn't you do something about it?" And we talked about that before, but see, this is the kind of thing that this narcissism kind of goes at. It's like, I just kind of sit back and reap all the benefits of God. God's just kind of like spoon feeding me throughout my life. And I don't really worry. I just kind of wait for the Holy Spirit to tell me what to do. And you don't even really have to be responsible to put any kind of reflective thought into anything. You just rely on your gut feelings and intuition, and just attribute to the Holy Spirit. And, and whatever happens, happens. So if it's good or bad, well, God, that was all part of God's plan.
Yeah. Well, and so there's not, I know we're trying like not to do like biblical criticism, but I think the book of Job is like pretty relevant for this topic.
Absolutely.
And this is where like doing good biblical scholarship, I think, would help a lot of people, realize that like, so the book of Job, if you look at it from like a textual criticism perspective, a literary criticism, there are amendments made that you can tell are amendments, to the original text. If you bracket those amendments out of the book of Job, the message of Job changes really, really dramatically, right? So at the beginning of Job, you have the devil and Satan's like, "Let me test Job." And so everything is given this like cosmic importance. Mm-hmm. And that's the same, that Job's suffering has cosmic importance is then reinforced at the end of the book, when justice, like God has a role in like restoring everything to Job. But if you bracket those amendments, which are much later additions to the text becomes basically a question about like, does suffering relate to morality? And the answer that the book gives is no, suffering is random and it doesn't have any purpose.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, let's put it this way. I mean, yeah, I think you're right. I don't know about random, but there is a sense where God lets things happen. And so
Right.
it's not like premeditated, like it's not all part of some plan that God has.
Well, but then, so part of the amendments is that, like, at the end of the book, God says, like, all of this happened for reasons that you can't even comprehend.
Yeah.
But I do have reasons for letting this happen.
Yeah.
But that, if you don't have that, if you look at the original form of the text, as far as we can tell what that is, it's basically God takes Job into the wilderness and says, look at these giant animals. You don't matter at all. And that's the end of the book.
Yeah. I mean, yes, God gives the smackdown to Job at the very end. But of course, Elihu, the three friends, you keep trying to convince him.
Right.
This kind of narcissism really reminds me a lot of, say, the Hindu caste system, which a lot of people are pushing back against. But see, this is the way in a lot of religions. It's not the poor people that embrace this. It's the wealthier people, the more successful people. The wealthy people say, oh, God's blessing us because we're right in the center of God's will. And so like in the Hindu caste system, we've lived many lives. And so we are, like, they even call like the top three tiers the twice born. So we've lived multiple lives. And so we deserve what we're getting. Okay.
Yeah.
While the poor people then tend to interpret religion the other way and say, well, the only way to really get to the afterlife is to renounce this world and be a total renouncer. And so we are closer to the kingdom of heaven than the rich people are.
Right.
And guess which side Jesus was on? It wasn't the first side. It was on the second side. But these narcissists, they'll just jump over all this stuff that Jesus said. And we still keep taking the donations or whatever from the uber wealthy people, because we like their money. And I don't know how you jump over. I mean, if people want to be narcissistic, I guess they can do that, and just put up with how people react to them. I don't think it's right. I just think it's really, it starts to get a little bit disgusting when they start, legitimizing their narcissism by using Jesus to do it, because this, in my opinion, goes directly against the grain of everything that Jesus said.
So can you expand on that a little bit? Like, how do you see people doing that?
Well, like I say, it's the people that are doing well. I say, oh yeah, God help me do this and God help me do that. And, I believe that, I believe that's all part of God's plan. And
we're so blessed to be given this money from heaven.
It's not the people that
right.
like, okay, I was born with bad genetics, so I've got this physical ailment. I got this physical ailment. I come from a poor family. I had this obstacle to overcome, and they don't say, oh, it's all part of God's plan. They're not the ones that are touting this. They'll say, I don't understand why God's letting this happen. Okay.
Yeah.
And they're still reluctant to blame it on God. Like, they don't want to blame God. Their question is, okay, well, God, can you maybe do something about it to ease our suffering or something? It's the people that everything's going their way. And it's like, they want to go back to this old mentality. So even like this mentality that was rejected by Jesus, like the whole prosperity gospel stuff. Okay.
Right.
And I don't want to just delve directly into that just yet, but like, so Jesus and the disciples, they encounter the man born blind from birth. Okay. And they're like, okay, well, whose sins he paying for? Well, that comes right out of the Levitical law. God, like in the 10 Commandments, God's like, okay, if you obey me, I'll bless you and this and this and this. But if you double cross me, I'm not only going to punish you, I will punish up to the third and fourth generations.
Right.
I'll punish your kids, your grandkids, your great grandkids, and maybe even your great great grandkids. And so people that are born into lower socioeconomic situations and such, everybody says, oh, well, they're paying for their sin. You know, those aren't the people that are embracing these days narcissism, because truthfully, we know enough about the world. We know enough about the world scientifically to understand how things work and how these kinds of things sometimes happen this way, sometimes happen that way. It's not like a big mystery. So why would people still be coming around? I think everything's a part of God's plan. Well, they are saying that not because they're that ignorant of science,
but because they're the winners.
Exactly. It's like, God help me win the lottery. Like, it's not the person, God help me lose my job. You know, it's not that. It's always the winners. And that's why I label this. That's how it's being used today. There were people from the past that before the scientific revolution, and even say the Protestant reformers who might give them a partial pass because they were just on that cusp around the time period coming up before Newton, you know, around the period of Galileo and those guys. Science was just starting to be develop at that point, modern science, what we call modern science. And so a lot of people did have a kind of a deterministic worldview. That was part of the ancient world's mythology. But now that we understand how things happen, this business of somehow still insisting that everything that happens is all being caused through supernatural forces. I mean, really? It's God's will that one person gets pancreatic cancer and another person dodges the bullet altogether? I don't know how you embrace something like that unless you are getting some kind of a really big ego boost out of it. I don't know what else it could be. Can you think of anything else it could be? Except maybe security. That might be another thing.
Yeah, I do think that everybody, I mean, I'm sure this is like a universal human experience, but everybody has that like sort of background anxiety of like, how am I going to be able to provide for myself?
Right.
Even if you have lots of money, like it could, you know, something terrible could happen and it could all go away. And I think that this narcissism is sort of a reaction clinging to like, well, God won't let me lose all this because I earned it. Right. I think like that sense of this is tied somehow to merit or justice, that I merit these blessings. I have earned them in some way, is really key to this worldview.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I do think it does. It's always like a false merit, right? It's people who like, oh, I inherited a bunch of money, but I am really responsible and I'm super smart, so I earned being given this money.
Yeah, I deserve it.
Right.
Yeah.
You've brought to mind there's an edit to the biblical text that's made in modern translations. In Matthew, I think, or no, it's Mark chapter 12, where there's the story of Jesus and the scribes, and they wear long robes, and
right.
You know, they devour widows' houses.
Right.
And then the very next story is about the widow who goes to the temple and gives her last 2 coins.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But in the original text, that's all like one obvious, like he's making one point here. The widow shouldn't be praised for giving her last 2 coins. The scribes should be condemned for taking her last 2 coins. But in modern Bibles, there's a heading break that breaks that story into 2 parts so that you can say like, oh yeah, don't be like the scribes. Don't be all showy with your wealth. But if you're poor, make sure you give those last 2 coins. Mm-hmm. You know, you make sure you still pay your tithe because then God will bless you. And I think that like part of the ugliness of this behavior comes when those who are winners and have adopted this mindset, this narcissistic mindset, teach it to those who struggle.
Well, this is exactly one of the condemnations that Jesus leveled at the Pharisees, because he said, you strap all these requirements on people and you won't even take even just a little finger and slightly lift somebody's load whatsoever. Right. And I guess it wouldn't be, it's not as bad or stinging, or let's say repulsive maybe, or bothersome to if somebody talks this way, but they really do pay attention to what happens in the lives of other people and they try to help them. But see, this whole thing of like, I know there's a sense, like we say, there's a certain sense where people want to know, well, if bad luck does happen, God's not going to let it get out of control. God's going to keep it all. Like I had students who, like, I often will ask students if they have any prayer requests. I'll pray have prayer before my classes. And it really helps the students, and they will share like requests, things that are burdening them. But I had a student, like, even before the first set of hurricanes went through, trying to remember what the name of it was. We got the Milton now. I'm trying to think what the first one.
Oh, Helene.
Helene, yes. So when Helene was going through, a student was like, pray for the people in Florida, or they're going to get hit by Helene. But of course, we do remember God's in control. And I'm like, okay, so what? I didn't press the student in front of the class. I wanted to say, so what are you asking? Are you saying, God, I accept it. You're probably going to let some people have it because it's part of your plan, but I hope that maybe you can find it in your heart to maybe lessen it some for some of these folks.
Yeah.
And see, this is the problem. This is one of the problems when you want to, it's kind of like wanting to have your cake and eat it too. So it's like, you want God who's just going to magically step in whenever something bad happens to you and make your problems go away. But then they don't know what to do whenever they see bad things do happen to other people. It's like, oh, well, God has a reason for it. Who are we to know what's in people's hearts? And
isn't that part of like when you adopt the mindset that like God is going to intervene miraculously for me, that when God doesn't do that, he must also have a reason. And, like I'm remembering the blaming of the AIDS epidemic on the gay community.
Mm-hmm.
That's God's judgment on the gays.
Yeah.
This is how we know that God condemns homosexuality, because all these people are getting AIDS.
Well, and that's what Pat Robertson said about Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah.
Wiping out
it's the same deal.
It's like, oh, they're being punished for Mardi Gras and all their debauchery.
Right. But you have to, like, you can see where like that logically makes sense if you have the mindset that like, well, God has blessed us with so much and all these other people are going through something terrible. They must have earned it somehow.
Yeah. That's where I really,
or maybe because if they didn't earn their suffering, then I might not have earned my blessings.
Okay. So, I mean, I hope this doesn't really super offend anybody, but this kind of stuff is why it makes me really uncomfortable to like stand up and sing God Bless America with everybody else. It's not like America has completely clean hands and pure hearts in how we've treated other cultures and countries. And when you start getting into the history and you realize how many times the United States would interfere in other governments and things where it was nothing more than just wealthy people trying to get a foot into business, be able to make money through some of these places, that well, anyway, we caused some of our own problems. It's just like we back these insurgent groups, and then 30, 40 years later, their children are basically trying to destroy the United States.
Yeah. So there's a funny story about that song, God Bless America. So Woody Guthrie is famous for having written This Land Is Your Land.
Right.
The story of how he was inspired to write This Land Is Your Land was he was hitchhiking across America from Los Angeles to New York, and he kept hearing Irving Berlin is the writer for God Bless America. He
Right.
kept hearing God Bless America everywhere, and it annoyed him so much that he was like, somebody has to write a better song about being patriotic. And so that's why he wrote This Land Is Your Land.
Yes.
As a response directly to God Bless America, because he found it so frustrating that the idea that like, oh, well, America is just one big happy family and we're all blessed equally. And, if God blesses America, then we all do success. So he wrote This Land Is Your Land as a critique of that.
Yeah. I don't really think, regardless of how Irving Berlin intended the song, what it meant to him personally or whatever, I'm just not that convinced that most people are singing it from the standpoint, God help us to be responsible and live up to our responsibilities as a world leader, yada, yada. I hear it more like, oh, God's made us so great and we're better than everybody else. That's what kind of the vibe I get. And I just, anyway.
Well, and if it's meant to be like a real prayer, which I'm too cynical to think that it's really sincere.
Yeah.
When people perform it nowadays, but it's a far cry from how Jesus taught people to pray, which was to ask for their daily bread.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not.
Yeah. Give us our freely purchased, open marketplace, capitalist produced bread.
Give us economic security for the next 80 years. That's not what he said. Unfortunately.
Give us our daily split top honey wheat bread.
Give us our Wonder Bread.
Yeah.
As we wonder you.
Okay. Well, what do you think? Should we wrap this portion up?
Yeah. Thanks for listening this week. If you'd like to reach out to us, you can find us at thehappycynics@gmail.com. Feel free to send some episode suggestions, some questions. If you have any comments on the show, send it there. We'd love it if you would review us on iTunes. If you do, you might get a shout out in a future episode. And if the world doesn't end, we'll see you next week.